Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm Sarah Kurz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs for Rose Community Foundation. Rose is proud to be the fiscal sponsor for the Colorado Media Project, since that is a funders collaborative. We're the place where funders are able to pool their resources that then get deployed through the Colorado Media Project. So thank you all for being here today. In this session, our panelists are going to discuss passing the mic. We're going to get to hear from some media innovators telling new stories and exploring new forms of storytelling. As local news gaps widen, more non-journalists or non-traditional journalists are stepping in and stepping up to create content that enlightens and informs Colorado residents. Some of the best are from historically marginalized communities, and these path-leading storytellers are bringing fresh perspectives that demand our attention. So we're excited to talk today about how newsrooms can amplify these voices, not only through traditional coverage, but also through authentic partnerships and curation. And what are the mutual benefits and caveats of doing so? So Kat Jaffee is going to facilitate our conversation. She'll introduce the rest of the panelists. Kat is a Durango-based audio producer, writer, and founder of House of Pod, which I think we have some fans in the room of, myself included. House of Pod is an award-winning audio company producing stories at the crossroads of social justice and science. So please join me in helping welcome Kat and our panelists.
Thank you, Sarah. Is this on? Can everyone hear me okay? Most importantly, the video. Everyone's happy? Okay, good. Sarah, thank you. I love the Rose Foundation. It helped our nonprofit AMP get started a few years back. So thank you. Thank you so much. And of course, thank you to everyone here from the Colorado Media Project who helped kind of convene us and get us together. This is pretty unique. So we have a lot we're going to go through today. And one of the first is maybe I could have said something in the beginning, but I actually wanted to use this as a teaching moment about new storytellers and forms of storytelling. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today isn't new. That's kind of the point, that we're going back to the ways that people have traditionally worked with their communities to tell stories. That's down to the DNA of what makes us human. And so I think one of the things that we can shed light on is how communities come together and lift each other up through storytelling, something we've been doing from the beginning of time. Before we get into all of that and some of the exciting things we're going to explore as a group, I want to introduce this amazing panel of folks we have here today, starting with Kate over at the end. Kate is a filmmaker and multimedia journalist at Rocky Mountain PBS. Also does some pretty fantastic freelance work, splitting time between the San Luis Valley area and Colorado Springs. Kate has 7 regional Emmys, has been working as a host producer, director, and videographer since 2014. Pretty badass. Can I swear? Is that okay? Yes? Okay. Yes, fantastic. Definitely a rising star. Then we have Kristan from the Institute of Science and Policy, the director of that program with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, a collaborator, friend, and role model for me. Kristan is a science and policy expert as well as a writer and communicator, sits on many boards, helps guide a lot of organizations here working at the intersection of science and policy in Colorado. And this is something I learned about you that I was like, really? You have an undergraduate degree in chemistry? which I think is pretty amazing. Yeah. And has worked just across the landscape in science policy from DC to now here in Colorado. Okay, then we have Ryan. Ryan is the general manager and program director of Inside Wire, the Colorado prison radio that we have, I think I can say a lot of us are celebrating, has recently opened just in the last year, but already is making many waves. Ryan's been working in broadcasting since 2001, which is also pretty impressive, and has toggled between creative projects and theater to now leading this program with the University of Denver Prison Arts Initiative. He's a 2022 lead fellow with the Solutions Journalism Network. And then I have to the left of me Anne-Marie Awad, who under description says henchman. Henchman, House of Pod. But I know about Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie was the host and writer for the award-winning production with CPR on Something and is now working with me at House of Pod. We are kicking off 6 projects, very big projects across the media landscape and spanning the world from our backyard here in Colorado to the far reaches of Samoa. Anne-Marie has worked with Call and Response, Dish City, CityCast, and is also a teacher and educator with the Association for Independence in Radio. I'm really excited to have everybody here. So thank you for joining us. And we're going to make the most of our time. But we're starting with something called power mapping. So I love to use hand signals to give me cues from the audience about, what we're saying and what you're picking up and liking. How many people have mapped power before? Thumbs up, yes. Thumbs to the middle, thumbs down, I've not mapped power. Okay, all right, cool, this will be fun. So we're going to have our panelists introduce themselves in the framework of power. And that can be sharing how they tell stories with communities, for communities, by communities, about communities, specifically in terms of relationships to power. So I'm going to introduce some framework around that, and then we'll have each of you map power within your organizations. And Kristan, in advance, I didn't check this with you. I pulled it together at like midnight last night, but you're in my power map. You're in my power map. It's going to be fine. Okay. Yeah, I know. A lot of improv here. Okay, so power map is a lot of times looking at how power works within a landscape based around relationships. And there are essentially only 3 questions that are pretty critical to a power map. And then there are 2 big pitfalls. The 3 questions are, what do people value in your community? Who controls access to what people value? And then how are you connected to each other? It all comes down to relationships. A lot of times we think of power as money. We think of it as these concrete assets. But actually most power in a community rests with the people all around us here today. So I went ahead as an example, because I'd like everybody in the audience to think about this, and certainly our panelists who are going to speak to themselves. I put together a very basic map of power with this one relationship I have with Kristan, because I felt like I could do this since you're here, if that's okay. Without asking any permission, I'm putting you on the spot. But it's a more streamlined version, so I didn't feel too bad about it. I wanted to talk about how House of Pod has our space, which is Kyle and the Olympic Auditorium. So we're based out of an 1,800-year-old building in 5 Points, Denver. And that's one of the things that has made it so that way we were able to get started. We have affordable space in the center of Denver where parking is not an issue, and someone has supported me from the beginning. I wasn't able to get that space necessarily because I had a lot of money. I was able to get that space because someone believed in me, and they loved the work that I did. So it was an affordable recording space offered by a strong community advocate who became an incredible friend. Now I work with Kristan at the Institute of Science and Policy. We make great podcasts together. And one of the aspects of my work with Kristan is that it feeds into why my landlord loves hosting us so much, because they love having the Denver Museum of Nature and Science in their space. They look down, and Kristan and her community is like an incredible added bonus. So that's something that is not monetary, but it's a relationship that feeds into why they would want to work with me. And then on the flip side, the Institute of Science and Policy, they like House of Pod Studio. It's a neutral space downtown. It's professional. It's part of the community that they can come in and support, and then also be able to bring in their guests. So it's something that is very much like a fixture in downtown Denver, and it works well with their values. And then the Institute of Science and Policy is an excellent partner for us because we have a shared vision, and because we believe in making the same kind of work, and because I respect and value them so much. We have ethics. We believe in fact checking. We want to do things in a more long-term community-driven way. And so even though in all of these situations, everyone is working together, we're not working together necessarily because of huge monetary gain. We're working because we have the same kind of values. And in return, there's lots of things that are happening that are non-tangible that are benefits. Like we have access to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science Network when one of these shows comes out. That's fantastic for us in terms of the distribution, getting the name out. That's such a wonderful, incredible partner. And then in exchange, we're in a page of National Geographic for the October issue, House of Pod is, and we cited the Denver Museum of Nature and Science as one of our great partners. None of that was paid. It just comes from those relationships. And that is so much of what the kind of work that we do. It is communities of communities where we are working together, we are collaborating, and we are thinking about how, as a tide, we can raise each other's boats. So another way of mapping, if you really want to do a power map, you do it with all your relationships. You do it with everybody you know. But another way of doing it is thinking about where you spend your energy. So generally speaking, if you were to put everyone you know on a grid, you're going to want the people that are influential and supportive of you. You're going to be wanting to put most of your attention in the upper quadrant. But it's okay if they're supportive and non-influential people, because what is influential and what is powerful, those things are often not what they seem. And I bring all this up because I have been asked so many times how we were able to get where we got with House of Pod without a journalism degree, without a big grant, without a ton of funding, without a bunch of backing. We're entirely community funded, entirely community driven. We are independent with a capital I. And that was largely because of these power maps. And so when I hear newsrooms say, oh, we can't do this, we can't do diversity, we can't do inclusion, we can't create a more equitable working place because we don't have the funds, we don't have the resources, we don't have the investments. To me, they haven't done a good job of mapping what their power is, because we are all capable of doing more based on the relationships we have. And that's not to say don't stop fundraising. Of course, go get that money, but also don't let your lack of financial resources hold you back from being able to do the right thing. And so that's what I think a lot of our community here on this panel is going to talk about today. And kind of keeping that in mind, you've heard about House of Pod, this is our work, blah, blah, blah. Anne-Marie will get there. I'd love for each of you to introduce yourself in terms of power, how your organizations operate, and what are the communities that you work with that help make it so that way you're redistributing power, and then you're also using those relationships to do the work that you do. Who'd like to get started? Should we start with Kate? Oh, gosh. And then move back? I'm thinking, yes, that was like such an emphatic, please.
I can give it a whirl. Okay. Hey, I'm Kate. So I work for Rocky Mountain PBS. So this is extraordinary, right? Because we have an affiliation and a platform that's very well established. The PBS name and brand is known, ubiquitously. So we have this extraordinary opportunity at every turn because we have access. We are able to, right off the bat, start at that place. So that's incredible. We have the reach as an established institution. And then for myself, this is particularly novel. I have the autonomy within that organization to go out, get the information I need, and I'm trusted to go and bring back our content. So I also get to focus on content development. We have whole teams, at Rocky Mountain Public Media, fundraising and marketing and working to keep the machine going. So again, another anomaly, I don't have to fundraise. I can go out and focus on the task at hand. So as a journalist, I do have a journalism degree. My background was in print media, and then I got my start in commercial radio as a teen. When I was 21 years old, my van broke down on tour. I'm a musician in Taos, New Mexico, and I did what anyone would do, which is I got a job at the local NPR affiliate as their news director. So for 3 years, I spent traveling around the Four Corners area and northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, particularly the San Luis Valley. And I had a daily morning half-hour news show. So I got to go around and solo produce all this incredible content. And that was my whole learning framework for everything that was to come. So I spent years doing that. And then at a certain point, I realized under the affiliation of NPR, there's only so much I'm going to be able to do telling these stories that are the tip of the iceberg. I think I can do more work in the community day to day than I can pumping through this machine of affiliation. I'm just going to quit my job with NPR and go live in the communities that I'm reporting from and do community work on the ground. I'm still going to interview folks, collect oral histories. So this was primarily in the San Luis Valley, particularly in the community of San Luis, which is the oldest incorporated town in Colorado, and has just a tremendous history that's cross-cultural from indigenous populations who have been there for 15,000 plus years, Hickory, Apache, Dene, and Ute peoples who have traversed the area for thousands and thousands of years, who still actually live there, which is very rare for people of their homelands to still live on the physical lands from which they come. The history of that is extraordinary. The reasons that people were able to maintain their ties to that land are wild. I mean, the stories here are truly revolutionary and unique. It's also where Spanish and Mexican settlers came from the south. And then, of course, we have the eastern expansion to the west. So it's a complete convergence of Anglo and subsequent European cultures and all of the pre-mentioned folks. So we're all coming together, still living in this absolute, I don't want to call it a clash. Oil and water does come to mind, but we're talking about very different value systems that have overlaid each other over time. So as a journalist, you come into the situation slamming your value system of multimedia into a community? No, it's getting into the value system and representing the value system and calibrating to the way and then permeating that. It's almost like a reverse engineer of how media often works. But long story short, so I'm in San Luis, still creating oral histories and all of these works. I worked in the community for years, left again to go on tour as a musician, and when I came back to Colorado in 2014, began working with Rocky Mountain PBS. Got to learn the whole production framework of television for the first time, having worked in newspapers and magazines for a long time, and all the freelance work and grant writing, etc. Well, in the last couple years, we've had purview to be able to open up our programming with a show that's called Colorado Voices. So our primary platform right now for regional programming or statewide programming at Rocky Mountain Public Media is a half-hour show. Actually airs tonight at 7. Our show tonight is about advocacy work, but it features stories from all over the state, often thematic topics. We have journalists primarily based in Denver who go out around the state and either immerse themselves in communities or spend time with communities and work on storytelling. For myself, it looks different, so I'm going to speak from my individual point of view. So there is the PBS side of it, which is everything I just described, and then there is what supports the journalism work, or the degree to which I have recognized the personal investment that needs to occur in order to support the journalism is a totally separate framework of like individual participation, community work, volunteerism. So I'm kind of speaking from both and as someone who is both in the community, working on community projects that are not affiliated with Rocky Mountain PBS, in the media and in the community, and also someone who's trying to bring larger stories from the community out into the larger world.
That was great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristan Uhlenbrock. And, thinking about power, I just want to say, Kat, you're kind of like a superpower for me. She brings such brilliance and compassion, and I feel very privileged to get to work and partner with her, and now with Anne-Marie as well, with House of Pod. So I do work at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, right? And often I sometimes lead with that because people's face smiles. And there's all these great memories here in Colorado of people who visited themselves when they were a kid or brought their kids there. And then I say, like, well, what do you do? And then I say, well, I have an Institute for Science and Policy I'm trying to build, and their faces just drop, and I just kind of get that blank stare, and I know I just said 2 words that make people either like not care or get frustrated or whatever, and I'm very cognizant of that. And as well as the privilege I have of working at a massive institution that has been around for over 100 years and has been trying to continue to do better with the communities in which they serve, in which they sit. And there's a lot of history and legacy with big nature and science museums that I'm not aware of because I don't come from a museum world. I come from the science and policy world. And so I feel really lucky to try to do this work where we're trying to work on society relevant issues, the issues that are happening here today in 2022 that people care about in their lives, whether it's water, our energy transition, or climate change, or wildfires, or trying to reintroduce wolves to Colorado, right? These issues that are hard and complex and matter to people are those issues that I get to work on a daily basis. And so I'm very aware of that. and very aware of this privilege I have to be doing it at a really large institution. I jokingly say I'm making it up as I go along. We are absolutely throwing some spaghetti on the wall to see what sticks, because this sort of work hasn't typically done under the purview of a nature and science or a science center museum. To engage in these society relevant conversations, to engage in policy conversations. We are policy neutral. We're not advocating for positions, but we are trying to bring science into these stories, and we're trying to bring in community voices and perspectives that often don't get heard when we talk about these really hard issues that are happening, where there's a lot of decision makers, a lot of power, and a lot of authority. So when we think about mapping power and how does power matter, that is day in and day out part of an underlying part of our conversation, both explicit and implicit, when we think about the work that we try to do. It's kind of two big buckets is how I've, and we're new. We were founded in 2018. I started in 2019, and I was the first staff person, and we're a very small team. So we're kind of a startup in the museum, which gives us a lot of freedom to try to do things that we want to do in a new way. But we kind of have two big buckets. We convene and we do storytelling. And wow, look at this awesome conference about convening and storytelling. And so those two things actually go hand in hand really closely together. Sometimes they actually intersect, and sometimes they don't, and projects are very different. But in the storytelling lane, and the idea of sharing power and elevating community voices, and including how are we doing that inclusively, how are we doing that thoughtfully, and how are we doing that with true honesty and integrity and with respect, is the type of just how we approach anything. It's been almost 3 years, and we're just now coming out with a mission and vision statement for kind of our institute, because we went around Colorado asking people, how could we add value to your lives? And I kind of take that as an approach to all of our work, which is, how are we just not some sort of additional thing that we get to do because we're at this big institution, but how are we adding value to people's lives in a way that's meaningful to them? And then how can we leverage doing those access to people and institutions and relationships and stuff? How can we start leveraging that in a way that makes it, amplify and expand? We're not, we're just a thread in this really big fabric that is a bunch of storytellers and content creators and people in the state. And we're not doing anything really unique or different. We're just trying to take our approach where we find that there's a lot of nuance and detail and complexity to these stories that sometimes gets overlooked. And so how do we kind of start to do that when we want to tell stories in a way that feels really truthful and honest? And, we're not doing a lot of it because it's extremely time intensive and resource intensive, and it's absolutely a labor of love. But that's a little bit about how we think about power. We're very aware of that in our work, and coming from a large institution, aware of history and stuff that we have to work to overcome, particularly when we are wanting to work with communities. I just recently, Kate and I were gushing because we're doing some work right now in the San Luis Valley, and we're trying to be really thoughtful about that work and that story, and then figure out, well, how can we leverage community voices and start to amplify some of these stories, hopefully in a new and creative way.
Thank you. I think we have one here too. Oh, good. Testing 1, 2. Yes. Thank you for that. Thank you both. And thank you, Kat, for the introduction. My name is Ryan Conarro. I am just pleased to get to be a part of this today, so thank you for the invitation. I am fortunate to be the general manager and program director for Inside Wire Colorado Prison Radio, which is a program of the University of Denver Prison Arts Initiative. So I should start by foregrounding that I am here as a representative of my colleagues at DUPI who are formerly incarcerated, who help manage and operate the station with me, and then our 17 producers across 4 prison facilities who are producing the content of Inside Wire right now. And so I wish that I did ask, can I have 3 people on the panel? I just tried to take it over, sort of, no offense. But I just think in many ways when I speak today, I'm coming as a representative of that larger group. I'd like to start, actually, I'll come back to Inside Wire in just a moment. I'd like to start by talking about my own personal identity and social location. I am white, cisgender, gay, American man, middle class, currently able-bodied. I grew up as an Army brat. My dad was an Army doctor. Lived for 4 years, incidentally, here in Aurora as a little kid. Family's rooted in Georgia. Finished high school there and went to college at New York University for theater and English. And then my first job out of college was through the AmeriCorps volunteer program at a radio station in Nome, Alaska. So I moved to Nome and was producing audio features at KNOM, AM and FM radio. And so that was the beginning of my broadcasting experience. And it, really impacted the course of my life. I often reflect on the fact that at that time in my life, I was 21 and thought, I was taking a year off and going to do this program and then go back, and, sort of the rest is history. I wound up living in Alaska for 14 years, moved from Nome to Juneau, worked for KTOO Public Media, which is the public radio station in Juneau in the state capital, and also continued to work in performing arts, really focusing on documentary and community work. So collaborating with communities, often starting with a school in a community to build a performance event based on people's real stories in that community. And sometimes over time, those have also had other extensions like a community website or an audio walk or other kinds of different outcomes. I came to University of Denver Prison Arts Initiative in 2020. I moved from Alaska to New York for 6 years and worked with an arts organization there, and was unfortunately lost that job when the pandemic hit, but fortunately got to come to University of Denver in summer of 2020. When I arrived, there wasn't yet an Inside Wire. The Prison Arts Initiative was kind of founded as a performing arts organization in prison, and like everyone else, was pivoting to remote virtual things, and somewhere in there we started cooking up this idea. Happily, the Department of Corrections was interested, and we spent about a year laying the groundwork and then launched on March 1st. So it's been, my path, has been it's been varied, and I'm tempted to be like, yes, I've been in broadcasting since 2001, but really there have been many years in there that I wasn't in broadcasting narrowly defined. So it's been exciting to come back into that, into radio, sort of as under that name. And I like to think and hope that varied background has been a helpful thing on the journey of creating Inside Wire as opposed to a limitation. So in terms of mapping the power dynamics within Inside Wire and the Prison Arts Initiative, I think I'll just name something that we talk about a lot in my organization, which is that we are situated in and within and relationship to two very large institutions. One is the University of Denver, and the other is the Colorado Department of Corrections. And it is a daily, hourly navigation. When I think about University of Denver, I can look at the influences and supports, to use the map, to refer to the map. I think probably, I'm happily not close enough to our budget to be able to tell you how much we get help from the university, but it's not enough as far as I'm concerned. But we have an office space. Probably the biggest thing is the name. It helps us to say we are DU. Oh, cool. And that's hard to measure as well, of course. We also are able to do things like, I was very pleased almost a year ago now, after a lot of effort, to secure an audio certificate for the people in the Inside Wire program who are inside. So when they complete their training, they get a certificate from University College at DU, which is a thing, which is great. So trying to leverage those things. Actually, this Sunday I'm going to bring on board our first crop of work study students to try to support our operations. So I'm always looking for how can this be a benefit to us? Because half the time it feels like I have to do what kind of paperwork for the university now? Meanwhile, we are working in the Department of Corrections, and we have as you may know, a very, relatively speaking, a very progressive leadership at the Colorado Department of Corrections currently. And the values and orientation of the executive leadership are how we've been able to have as much involvement in facilities across the state and how be able to move as quickly as we did with Inside Wire. We are in a contract with them, so a bulk of our funding is through a contract with DOC. So we have a very carefully articulated mission statement at the Prison Arts Initiative and at Inside Wire that is about examining the prison system, cultivating a sense of meaning and purpose for people who are inside currently, certainly, hoping to build skills and capacities for those folks, most of whom, 95% of whom will get out, and also cultivate a public conversation about what is prison in Colorado and the U.S., complexify the conversation in a system that is conventionally, as we all know, very opaque. It's successful, in my experience, as someone who didn't work in carceral settings until coming to Colorado. I don't know what's happening in prison. I don't actually know what the system is doing. So we're trying to push against that. And we are in a dance with the system itself so that we can continue to go in every day and do the work, do the first part of the work to cultivate meaning and purpose today for the people we work with. So a critical conversation, yes, but also we have to take care to be collaborative about that conversation. This is our program schedule, and we are 24/7. We have a range of programs from music to features to talk to a couple highlights are hotlines, which is 3 times a day, announcements, opportunities. We call it an audio bulletin board for people inside prison. We have these features at 9 p.m. every night, and then on the weekends they repeat in Features Fest, back-to-back features, which are story-focused dialogues. Our residents also interview staff. That's a big part of the work that we do, is to try to push against the staff versus resident, us versus them kind of dynamic. So often staff will come and co-host our morning show, for example, which is so great. And then we have on Fridays and Saturdays, this show Up to the Minute at 6 p.m. is an unfiltered conversation between incarcerated producers and executive staff at the DOC weekly. So we got the DOC leadership to fortunately agree to approach our teams as any other media team. They sit down for an interview, they're done, my team takes it and edits it and it airs. There's no sort of additional layer of vetting that has to happen. We are streaming online, coloradoprisonradio.com, and Inside Wire is the name of our app, which you can get on your phone. So that's another really exciting thing, is that we're not only broadcasting inside, but also to the public. So please tune in whenever you'd like to. I think our music library is awesome, and I'm not biased. So I'll leave it there for now, but thank you.
Thank you. House of Pod Henchman. Anne-Marie here. So I, similar to Kate, come from a pretty traditional journalism background. I have the whole J-School degree. I worked in public media for about close to 10 years in stations all over the place, including here in Colorado. And I come to House of Pod with this experience because I think over the course of my career, I started to feel very frustrated with how traditional news organizations tended to treat community stories. A through line in my career is sort of, I guess the term is social justice stories. And so I've always gravitated toward stories about homelessness, formerly incarcerated people, racial injustice, things like that. And I, without fail, across news organizations, it's usually treated as like a one-off. We did a story about that once, we can move on. And I think that's really damaging to community trust. And I think I had gotten to a point in my career in traditional media where I started to just feel like I was hitting a limit with these kind of partnerships. And so my work with House of Pod has been kind of like a 180, because my first experience working with the organization was co-teaching the From the Margins to the Center podcast incubator last fall. And this was an opportunity for us to work with a group of BIPOC individuals who got free training, free access to equipment, and a lasting relationship with House of Pod. We're still in touch with these folks. And there was no mandate to create a story that worked out for us as an organization. There was no desire to sort of manhandle or shape the kinds of stories that we wanted these folks to tell. We gave them a pretty simple prompt, which was to tell a story about themselves. And it was incredible to listen to what they had come up with by just the end of a weekend. And so it felt like a really big affirmation that these things are possible. These things are not only possible, but they're possible in kind of ways that feel like a no-brainer, especially when you're on the other side of it and you're in a big, well-resourced organization. You can just give stuff away. That's really what it comes down to sometimes. As you may know, I worked for Colorado Public Radio for quite some time. Colorado Public Radio is the statewide public media network now. If anybody's got power, I would argue they're a very good example. And I think, I'll give you an example. There was an idea that I had when I was with the organization that we could just give public libraries around the state, make your own podcast kits. Make your own podcast. Here's some easy directions. Here's like a cheap mic and a recorder. Go crazy. And hey, if you want, share that stuff with us. And we can work with you to create a show or create a segment or something like that. But give the stuff away first. And I think the real roadblock there was, what do we get out of it as an organization? What if we don't get anything? And I think one of the beautiful things that we do at House of Pod is like, we don't ask that pretty much ever. Every relationship has reciprocity built into it. We are there to be, as a mentor of mine once said, and I bring this up a lot, relational and not transactional. We do not take stories from people. We work with them to shepherd them start to finish. And then we stay in touch with those folks even after we're not producing anything anymore. And I think this is what's so rewarding about this work, right? There's something bigger here than just putting something online that's going to get a lot of clicks. This is about fostering change for the better in people's communities, and storytelling is this powerful tool to do that.
Oh, you have one. Oh, yeah. Thank you. You're right. I do. I'm just taking the mic. That's the last thing I want to do. Wow. Okay. You each, thank you so much for everything you shared, and I loved hearing your backstories. So thank you for giving some of that as well. For the audience, there might be some themes that have popped up for you. They certainly have for me. And one of them is that you may hear that all of these folks have had their foot in larger organizations, bigger establishments, and then also another foot that is very much rooted in a community and based around having partnerships, certain investment with those individuals. And some things that I always say that make those kinds of partnerships key are really, really simple. It just comes down to two things only: communication, and with that transparency, redistribution of power, bringing people into that, and then saying, I'm going to use this platform, I'm going to use this power I've mapped, and I'm going to hand over the mic. I'm going to give you those opportunities that you have rightfully earned because you come into this with knowledge and a context that I don't have. And so in that vein, I would love to hear from each of you. What does a good partnership look like for you? And what does something extractive look like for you?
Should I set a timer before I start? I should.
If you give me permission.
Please, like 90 seconds.
Why don't we double that? That really feels right. Project managers.
Yeah. The word that comes up for me is trust, and it's this cultivation of trust, and how does that show up in action? One thing that I love about Inside Wire is that it's a large enough, sort of ambitious or sort of audacious enough proposal that we cannot do it without everyone involved actually having agency and having control and having a voice. it moves too fast. It's, it's 24/7 content, new content every week. And so that all really pushes against some of the conventions of the correctional system. For 17 incarcerated people to be producing stuff that's being broadcast, it's dicey. And there are real security issues, security questions to be asked. And I should say, in case you're wondering, I review all audio that goes before it airs. And then it is reviewed by the intelligence team at the DOC, who are trained to listen out for things like potentially coded gang communication and stuff like that. That potentially coded communication is the scariest part of this for the DOC. And I'm happy to say that I have full trust in my team, and I guess that's the theme, is that I've spent time in other community partnerships and relationships and projects where I feel like lip service has been paid to, like, this is a real collaboration, and then somebody came in and sort of like made it look nice or imposed their aesthetic frame on top of the idea that came from the community member, and made it look nice to them or to the organization hosting it or whatever. And I think this is probably the closest that I've been able to get to a situation where, no, it's really shared and it can't but be that. So trust.
You did great. 100% on the trust. And trust takes time. Sometimes trust needs to be rebuilt. Should be no assumption that trust exists, I feel like. And sometimes there is that assumption. I started at the museum, and one of the first big talking points was people sharing with me how much the museum is trusted, right? And so there's these declining trust in governments, declining trust in media, and guess what? The museum's trusted. And I was like, okay, we're gonna question that number. It is, right? So we often move away from this kind of talking points and get down to actual conversations with people. And so trust is 100% of that. I think when it comes to relationships and partnerships, there's so many levels to that Kat question, from like, none of my work is done without partners. And that is huge, right? I'm talking about big organizational partners, individual people. So there's such a big span in there when we talk about partnerships. And they all have to come with intent, with the intent that things are going to be co-created. We really lean a lot into that. And that isn't meaning that we don't have a perspective and they don't have a perspective, but kind of where can you kind of start with that common ground of where are we benefiting each other, and then build from that sort of perspective so that it doesn't feel, I don't know if you said exploitive or extractive, but all of those are not good. Because the minute anyone feels used, I feel like, or isn't, there is no reciprocity happening, that's not a good relationship. And so what are people doing in it? And that just leads to ultimately some really long burnings of bridges and some bad, poor outcomes that I don't think anyone wants. But trust is really important, 100%. And I think it's a fascinating word. And we spend a lot of time talking about what does this even mean, and everyone's going to have a different perspective on what it means to them. And this work that sometimes you want to do has to go super slow. And sometimes I feel like I have that luxury and that privilege to go really slow because I don't work in a news organization. I don't have those pressures and demands, and I recognize that. And so then I have people coming to me saying, hey, I want to work with you because of these relationships that you've built and because of these connections that you have. And it isn't that I'm being a gatekeeper, but I'm being really thoughtful in when something feels as though people want to work with me to then work with this other person. And that to me isn't okay. And so then it's like, well, okay, well, what are your interests, right? And trying to start that conversation with them. And so 98% of my job, I feel like, is literally, talking with people to just, figure out how all this kind of fits together and works together ultimately, because back to the idea of once you start, burning bridges and losing that reputation and those relationships, right? you're in a spiral downhill, and that's not good.
Got it. So we could have a whole other panel about news and how this stuff gets handled in news, and I can just rant and rave all day long. I think I'm glad that you use the word gatekeeper, because I do think that is the role that a lot of media organizations still see themselves serving. And so I have seen these community projects where we will partner with the community, but sort of like we get like a final veto on everything. Or something like that, or we don't try to take the ideas and turn them into something if it doesn't fit in sort of with our current editorial goals. And so I think the projects that I have seen that have been really successful are the ones where you allow the community to come in and give you insight onto sort of like these structural things that you could do differently. And so working in a public radio newsroom, I can say, it's not like newspapers. It's not like a certain number of inches has to get filled every day. It's not like if you don't produce enough stuff, there'll just be nothing on the radio. There will still be morning edition. But we in news have so much more control over what the news is than I think we give ourselves credit for. And so we say, well, why don't these communities want to partner with us? They don't hear themselves on the air. They hear us partnering with other figures in the community that may be hostile to them. Like, I did a show about weed, and one of the things that came up every season from my bosses was, when are you going to do a police ride-along? I'm not. Plenty of places to get that story. But my podcast is about how this affects everyday people. And so, yes, we will interview somebody who has a felony record from dealing cannabis and talk about how that affects them today. But I'm not going to hang out with a cop all day long and have them explain to me why that this is important to regular people. Because I also know cops don't always tell the truth. And so I think what I'm trying to say here is that there are bigger elements to sort of the trustworthiness between a community and a newsroom that leaders in a newsroom don't often consider. They look at that police ride-along as well, yeah, everybody does that. Why wouldn't we do that? And they don't see what that might mean for marginalized communities to have your reporter in the passenger seat of a cop car all day. And so, sorry, now I'm rambling. I think really the gatekeeper element is sort of the biggest obstacle in news. I think there is still a feeling that, well, we went to J school. We know what we're talking about. We've been doing this for a while. And ultimately, we're the arbiters of what's important in this community. And I think that is the failing point every time. These people are experts on their own lives and can tell their own stories. And I think that's a real hard thing for news leadership in a lot of traditional organizations to swallow. Okay, now it's your turn.
Yeah, I was you'll inspire me. Oh man, there's so many avenues for this. I often think about my particular role as a Venn diagram. So I'm working within two very different constructs, feeling seemingly to myself, I perceive that I'm working within at least two different, but two main different value systems all the time. Yes, I do work for an institution that has hard deadlines and the constant grind culture of production and daily activity and needing to be responsible to producing regular content, regardless of how many years it may take to formulate and maintain trust and relationships. The relationship building aspect is not factored into the time it takes to produce the story. So I have a construct at Rocky Mountain PBS, which is absolutely gorgeous. It's I'm the luckiest human in the world. I get to write 2,500 word articles, give or take, and produce 3 to 30 minute videos, documentary style, about subjects, so I can complement the visual aspect with the written word, etc. So in my mind, I have the best of all worlds. When I used to work for the radio, I'd think how ironic that I'm, trying to showcase the most beautiful place and people in the world on radio. It's such a difficult, expression when people learn in so many different ways and receive information in so many different ways. I feel like I can work with communities to understand what are we going to show. Are we, how people receive the information is just as important as like we're thinking about, basically I'm saying I have every avenue for which we could disseminate information, many different modalities and art forms to experiment with. So I'm not limited to just one modality. I feel like I can really experiment with each piece, what it calls for and what it's looking for. But at the same time, so I really absolutely love that work. It's so incredible. And there's also a recognition that there is no way, understanding being in community, really seeing what is required in order to perpetuate and maintain communication, trust, strength. The sun never sets on the work that is going into this, and it isn't an institutional commitment. It's an individual, personal commitment to understand what these hard conversations are that need to be had. What does it look like to keep and build trust in a community? It is completely, we know it's individual to every single community that we're working in. So the hallway that I'm walking down, this dimly lit cave that I'm traversing through as I'm understanding where I need to show up and how I need to show up and what is needed and meeting and responding to those needs. Personally, and I don't think this is an expectation for me as a journalist, but as a human being and knowing vocationally what I want to accomplish in my lifetime, I've completely changed my lifestyle and the way that I relate with the world in order to be able to show up when I'm needed to do what I have seen needs to be done to maintain those relationships. So that's amazing, but it's not something that I think is like, realistic to expect from every journalist who has a day-turn story or who's, creating multiple reports about multiple subjects over time. So I think about kind of inversely, yes, there's like this material appearance aspect of what a partnership and what a relationship looks like. There's the logos appearing together. There's the us and this collaborative, outward-facing messaging. And then there's also like the boots on the ground, literal facilitation of community partnerships and work that goes. It's like the forward-facing product is the video and the article, and that's the tip of the iceberg. But then if you look below that high water line or low water line, as it were, what is the life or the path to be created in order to sustain the trust required to tell the stories? So I'm both a journalist coming in from the outside to work with communities, but then on the inverse side, school and community work is such a huge part of it. I appreciate that you mentioned working in the schools. Something that I identified that I wanted to work on years ago was creating youth film programs, and working with youth in the communities, which I've done for years, but this is the first year I've actually been able to go into the school and work directly with students as part of curriculum. This is volunteer work that I understand that's been identified as something that is needed that would be supportive within the community, integrating the students and youth, even letting them, in on the production processes of documentaries I'm creating, as I'm working with the elders and the folks in the community, recognizing the students and the youth need to be here too. And so bringing them into that, but then the beautiful thing about the schoolwork is, to your point, often when there is a forward-facing partnership, the end product is kind of the thing. But we all know that the process is really the thing and that the process never ends. So also it's like, I know with PBS, I know what I'm producing for them looks a certain way. And I know that every story is going to get somehow fit into what that looks like. So the inverse way of approaching that is working with the community directly to say, not only who, what, where, when, why is determined by the community in terms of content creation, but also the how of. It's not expected. There is not a mandate to turn any material back to an institution, that the community themselves can determine if they would like to share that just within the community or how they would like to disseminate that information beyond their community if they so choose. So to your point, removing the expectation that there is a product in the construct of a world that has to have an appearance forward-facing thing in order to be a success. Because again, in the looking at different values.
I'm going to give you, no, you're okay, you're doing great, but last thought.
Yes, value systems, essentially calibrating to the value system of the community instead of the value system of the institution.
Fantastic. Beautiful closing. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'd love to leave time to open it up to everybody. For House of Pod, so going back to our map, the power map, there's a whole section here that doesn't exist. It's like, this is, I mean, lots of sections, but this is just talking about our space. And then there's a whole kind of web underneath of the fact that we were able to use a partnership that paid to be able to make it so that way our space, our studio, was available very affordably for 750 community members that you don't see on this map, but they came and recorded. We've had over 750 shows recorded out of House of Pod in 5 years. And one of the key things about that is everybody who records in our space owns that content. House of Pod doesn't own that content. They 100% own that content. They can run ads on that content. They can sell it if they want to. They can monetize. We aren't the ones in charge of that. We are just a community space that is helping to facilitate people in recording and producing high quality stories that they have ownership of. House of Pod has done very little original content, much to my chagrin. I hope that changes soon. And there's still room for growth for us. Even in all of that, we have struggled with our financial models. We have not always been able to sustainably do things that we want to. We've had to change our pricing structure and the way people can access our space. There is a lot we have to navigate, and there's still many people who I don't necessarily think feel like they can access our space and be able to do what they want to do in it. And that is something that I am reckoning as that is an area for growth for us. I'm curious for all of you, what are areas of growth in your work and in the industry at large in order to make this space one in which people can own their content and feel like they have control with how their stories are told?
I guess I can go. I think since leaving traditional news, I've worked with a bunch of different clients, House of Pod included, and I think it's been really sort of helpful to like reevaluate some golden rules about journalism. So for example, we would never typically like let the subject of an interview read an interview with them before we publish it, something like that. Earlier this year, I worked on a pilot with the National Alliance for Mental Illness. And the topics of these pilots are very delicate, and these are meant to be like patient information tools. And so we had invited somebody with borderline personality disorder and somebody with bipolar to share their experience. Of course, we're going to let them look at it. You know, these folks have families. Their families are heavily involved in their care history. And ultimately, we as the creators don't want to cause any harm to these people. The ultimate goal is to increase understanding and help patients. And so I think it is helpful to me, especially somebody who continues to, I teach journalism, I talk to students all the time about this, that, you know, there aren't necessarily hard and fast rules in this business. And I think it is completely fair and honestly part of our responsibility to reevaluate when the situation calls for it. And that's a fundamental recognition of power, right? I'm the producer in that situation. I have the power to put this person's story out in the world, whether they like it or not. But it is incumbent on me to make a different choice. I think also, just as the industry at large, I think there is still a great deal of hand-wringing over what who all of this is for and who we are making content for. I'll never forget, like, one of my earliest jobs in public media. I was in a station in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I really wanted to do stories about an area north of Baton Rouge, which is called Scotlandville, heavily black area. It used to be like a very prosperous, upper middle class black neighborhood, and then the Exxon plant came. And I wanted to pitch all these stories about the long-term impacts. So I came back to the station one time, and my boss was like, well, where were you? I told him I was working on this story up in Scotlandville. He said, are you lost? Those people don't give. And those people don't listen. So why would we do stories about them? I think that that type of thinking is still much more common in media than many folks would like to admit. And I think in public media in particular, where our mandate, I say our mandate is to create content that informs and engages, that represents a diverse array of the American public. It's all right there in the 1967 Public Broadcasting Act. That's our mandate from the government. And I cannot say that public media always meets that mandate. And so asking who the product is for, I think, is a really important part of that.
I love it. Also, everybody else, you get 1 minute because I want to leave time. No, you did
Sure.
great. I want to leave time for questions.
Thank you for that. And thank you for this question. I think many comments here are resonating for me. When I think about my experience beginning doing storytelling work, broadcasting work, I mentioned it was in rural Alaska, and I was very fortunate to expand my own sense of the world, my own sense of relationships with different communities and people different from me, to get proximate with people different than from me long term, and start to cultivate mutual care. And I think that is kind of a thread for me. Like, that's actually what I hope that our work and my work can do for other people as listeners or consumers of the media that we make, that they can find some version of that experience and maybe be inspired to seek that more deeply themselves. So I'm going to reflect on that, I think, coming out of this. And in terms of what next for Inside Wire, I think continuing to figure out how within navigation of relationship with the correctional system we can do that. That the one of the superpowers, the potential superpowers of Inside Wire is that it is breaking through the walls, and I can listen to a producer's morning show at home making coffee and soak in his wife or her son. That really is at the heart of it. So the more that we can continue to build in that direction, the better we'll be doing, I think.
This is a good question. It's very hard. So I don't know if I'm going to answer it as well as my colleagues here on the right have. I'll say a couple things, which is, when I'm doing some of these stories that we've been doing, and we're pretty new in this landscape, is I have a ton of anxiety. Kat can attest to that. And Anne-Marie's seeing some of it now too, because I'm like, what if we're getting it wrong? What if we are not getting someone's story right who just sat down with us for 3 hours, and I can't use 3 hours of that content? And I'm seeing head nods. Everyone has this feeling, right? And to me, that anxiety and that stress and that nervousness of wanting to do it right and do it justice by the intent, because our stories there are people who are disagreeing. And we are careful of not trying to do both sidism, yet giving people that voice to tell that story that they want to tell and the way that they view and they see the world. So our issues are often really political, but we're apolitical. Our issues are often really controversial, and there isn't easy answers. And so I'm in the studio on the mic going, there are no easy answers. And so right? Because it really isn't. Title name, there are no easy answers. And so I have that, and you guys can feel it, like, those visceral reactions I'm still having just sitting here talking about it, because that is something I want to continue to embrace as much as stress as it gives me, because I think in that anxiety of wanting to make sure people's voices and stories are told like they want to be told, I think we'll do good by that. And so that's a continued growth for me too. And I'll say the one other growth is what I'm hoping comes out of some of this stuff as we continue to do more is people say it, aha, I didn't know that. I learned something new, and or even greater, wow, I want to do something about that. And they want to take an action. I'm not telling them an action to take, but there's something there that then inspires people to want to make a change and to do something differently. And hopefully that is led with both compassion and empathy to some of these stories.
Yeah, so marginalization in some of the communities I work in is often perpetuated by fly-by or helicopter short-term journalism. And so just knowing, to your point, in terms of incorporating, I'm talking to people who don't talk to each other, or I'm talking to hundreds, over the course of time, dozens, if not hundreds of people who don't like each other, or may have decades-long historic feuds that keep them apart. But if the point of unity is that I'm able to have conversations with all these people, that means that a thread of unity exists and can be found. And if that thread of unity, that middle of the Venn diagram, can be perpetuated and uplifted, then in my mind, that's where journalism has the greatest power to weave the unification of the perspectives. If you're a person if people are telling you their joys and their sorrows, and you're hearing the breadth of the experience, that's the beauty, is you don't have to pick sides. You can uplift, the unification. And then public media is just such a blessing, because to me, the public is my boss. And I know that a story hits the mark only if the subject tells me that they feel completely represented by the story. That's my only mark of success, is if the person seeing the video and reading the article says, hell yeah, you got it, like, thank you. Because, yeah, that's it.
I love it. Okay, so top line, before we kind of open it up to questions, I think we might have time for one or two. One. Top line. I would say, don't take stories, but communicate and partner and collaborate and distribute power with communities. Don't take their stories. Do all those other things. And that can also be for bigger news organizations thinking through how to make those partnerships. It happens well with folks who do have the time to be able to spend on the ground building those relationships. And there are plenty of people that are not on this panel that do that. And it's an effort, and it is an intentionality, and it will not decrease the quality of your journalism. So, what questions are out there, if any? Yeah, Nina.
But if we only get one, I want to make sure.
Anybody else? Okay.
Thank you. So some of you touched on this in terms of just referencing the power that you all have in your positions. But I'm curious, like, as the person with the camera, with the microphone, I understand that there's the passing the microphone concept, like you tell the story instead of me. But inherently in your position, you're the person with the education of the space who is maybe educating this person on this is how storytelling can be done. And there's still an autonomy from that person, but as the person who's organizing the project or bringing the community into your space, there's still an inherent power that always exists there. So how kind of do you deal with that dynamic, especially when you're not part of the community that you're not representing, but that is sharing?
I can jump in quick, if that sounds okay. I think transparency, redistribution of power. So, as I've mentioned before, we will have, for a number of the projects that can afford it, we will have the producers be from the community that the story is about. To me, that's the biggest redistribution of power that you can have, is where you are paying people with hired jobs and compensating for that experience and valuing it and saying, I want to bring you into how this thing is made. That's the best possible one. And if you can't do that, and I haven't always been able to do that, something I will do is take off my equipment. It doesn't always happen, but I'll take off my equipment, teach a community member how to use it, and then send them in and be like, okay, collect the stories that you be the curator. You collect the stories that are right for you. And we did do this with Guardians of the River for some of the work there. And then we followed up over and over and over again in an iterative process. The final thing is transparency. And this I keep with every project I work on. If I'm ever going to go in for an interview, I do my very best to explain exactly how this will be used. This is the context of how this is going to be used. This is how things are going to be framed. This is what we're working on. The emails that I'm working on a piece with Radiolab, and I actually thought they were going to kick me off the team the other day because I just gave the whole pitch of the story to one of our subjects. I was like, I know this has been really controversial, so this is exactly how the entire story is going to go, and this is where we'll fit you in. What do you think about this? And the person was like, thank you so much for that information. No, I don't want to be interviewed live. And I was like, I am so glad you said no. Why don't we follow up on a phone call not recorded? I'd like to hear what your opinions and thoughts are, and then that's something that I, as a narrator, will represent in the work. But I think everyone has the ability to make decisions if they have the data. if they are informed. And that is the nicest, most respectful and kind thing, least extractive thing you could do. Just give people the same information that you have and then let them make that choice. And even better, if you can give them the power that you have and compensate for that, dear God. The number of people who are like, I want to partner with you, but I got this great idea. I'll take all the content that's made at House of Pod, we'll put it for free on our radio station, and no one can run ads or do anything, and we'll just take all the listeners and all those subscribers. Like, I don't even know how podcasts work. Oh my God. It's a partnership, right? And I'm like, let me tell you something. Interview podcasters. Ask them, is that something that's valuable to you? And then listen to their response, because I think everyone's going to say, no, I need this many listeners so that way I can get this kind of support. If I'm taking my content, putting it on your radio station, and I'm not able to redirect people back to my feed or run advertising, I'm giving you my stuff for free, and that communicates to me that you don't value my art or my work. And like, what kind of world do we want to live in that's like that? How can we be advocates of art and storytelling and not pay creators who are putting in all that time and energy? Like, that's obviously the thing that irks me, and it's something I work with so many folks to advocate for themselves and the work that they put into their communities, because it has value, back to that power map. And I think the more we can acknowledge that, the more that people will feel seen.
I think that my biggest thing when I teach students is, to me, journalists and producers, like, you are civilians. There is not, you don't get a special rank from the government that like gives you special powers. And I think that's very important. It just blows people's minds. I think that's very important to remind people of, because it's like the skills you have are made for giving and sharing. Yeah. There's so little to nothing that separates you from the people that you cover, and to be able to hand that over to somebody and be like, you can do this too, is incredibly powerful. I think that is a hard thing for a lot of institutions, for the reasons that I've talked about. I feel like I've been so negative on this panel, so I'm going to try it to be end on a positive note. I think it's really important, like, especially for people who work at news organizations who are in the role of a journalist, you got to be in a community when there's not a reason for you to be. Yeah. I mean, like, you cannot just show up when there's a shooting, when there's a tragedy of some kind, when there's an event, a festival, a sporting event, something like that. You have to find it to be worth your time to get to know that community. And there's no substitute for that. I tell journalism students all the time, because in public media, you move all over the place. There is like no better way to explore a new place than being a journalist, being like a curious person, showing up to stuff, just talking to people. But I think there's a real danger of being in a bubble. And I think you got to really challenge yourself as a journalist or producer to get out of that bubble as much as possible. And yeah, I think that's the only way.
I think I was just going to summarize what I was trying to get at with my long-winded answer earlier, was that I am trying to, approach that from both sides, redistributing my skills and talents within the power of the institutional framework, and being in the community, 100% grassroots learning from the community. And
yeah, everyone's going to say it. I jokingly say, like, you all are humans and people too, 100%. You all are communities and members of communities. And when we talk about community as a thing over here, that just, as you all can tell, I'm not a journalist, so I get to come at this. But I was trained as a scientist, but I don't do any of that anymore. I like to tell stories. But I'll go and I'll talk to scientists, and they had the same thing. And I was in a session recently. We're trying to talk about climate democracy, and they're talking about their own mental health, and like that they're members of a community too who are also experiencing climate change, who are also trying to deal with this, right? And so, like, I like to think of, we all are humans. Yeah, you're not part of every community, but you are part of some communities, and you should think of yourself as a member of a community, or 2 or 3 or 5.
I love that. I'll just add another perspective that comes up for me is in my role training my collaborators inside prison as audio producers. The word came up for me too, Kat, transparency. But in terms of our training, I think I get back to, like, what is your objective with what you're making right now? So I can be like on this end of the spectrum. If you want me to hear the words that person is saying and you've mixed this audio so loud that I can't hear the words, you're not achieving your objective. So the mix needs to be different. The audio needs, the sound bed needs to be lower. Then there's another area of the spectrum, which is what's happening in the field. Like, what is the sound of audio, the podcast world? What are conventions that are popular now? Let's use that as a reference point. Do you want to be doing that? Do you want to call upon other conventions? And then there's my aesthetic taste, and just being transparent about that's influencing my notes when I review something, just to say, this one I file under, I don't like what you did there, but actually I'm just acknowledging it's just because it grates for my ear. But you like it, we'll keep it. I'm just acknowledging that. So as a trainer, and we issue these audio certificates that I was talking about earlier, trying to be transparent about where I'm starting from, and what the sort of authority there is or is not.
I love it. Okay, we are going to wrap things up. Thank you all so much for joining. Sarah.
Huge thanks to our panelists today. In philanthropy, we spend a lot of time thinking about how to build authentic relationships with community that are rooted in trust and not extractive, and I love hearing it from a different perspective. So thank you all for that discussion. For everybody else, the next thing on the calendar is at 12:30, so you have a little bit of a break between then. Between now and then, we'll be in the room where breakfast was, sort of at the corner over there. For lunch, we'll be hearing from the Colorado Voices Initiative and the number of different communities that have been involved in that effort. So please join us for lunch, and thank you all for being here. Thanks to our panelists.